Welcome back to the Pirate Republic. This is an audiobook presentation of Pirates of the Wild West, the first novel in the Storm of Time series, released one chapter at a time. Today, before we get into Chapter 11, Locked and Loaded, we're going to say happy birthday to Anne Bonny. That's right, March 8th, today when this episode comes out, Anne Bonny was born back in 1697. She would grow up to become one of the most feared and fascinating pirates of the Golden Age. Most pirate fans know the highlights, that she sailed with Jack Rackham alongside Mary Read and was captured in Jamaica in 1720. This was after Rackham's crew was defeated by the British privateers that were hunting them. But Anne Bonny's story contains a few lesser-known twists that make her even more remarkable. Did you know that she was raised as a boy? Anne was born in Ireland to a lawyer and his housemaid. To hide this scandal, her father reportedly dressed her as a boy and introduced her to society as his young clerk. It was an early taste of the disguise that would later allow her to sail among the pirates. Before she ever hoisted the black flag, Anne Bonny reportedly spent time in Nassau in the Bahamas. During the final years when the town functioned as the infamous Pirate Republic, at its height around 1715 to 1718, Nassau was effectively governed by the pirates themselves, including famous captains like Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, and a young Edward Thatch, better known as Blackbeard. By the time Anne arrived, the British were moving to retake the island and restore order under Governor Woodes Rogers. Anne may have witnessed the collapse of the Pirate Republic firsthand, a turning point that pushed many pirates back to sea, including the crew she would later join. She was known for her violent temper. One early story from her youth in South Carolina claims Anne stabbed a servant girl with a knife during an argument. Another tale tells that she once beat a man who tried to assault her so badly that he barely escaped alive. Whether exaggerated or not, the stories hint that Anne was not someone easily intimidated. One of the most unusual stories about Anne Bonny involved a duel fought over her honor. While living in South Carolina, Anne reportedly attracted the attention of two suitors. One of the men began harassing her persistently, and tensions escalated until a duel was arranged between the two rival men. But Anne Bonny wasn't about to let someone else fight her battles. According to the story, Anne confronted the troublesome suitor herself, drawing a pistol and firing a warning shot that convinced him to abandon his pursuit immediately. The other man, James Bonny, a small-time sailor, admired her fearless spirit and eventually married her. The marriage didn't last very long. Anne soon left him behind for more adventurous life at sea, and eventually for the pirate captain Calico Jack Rackham. When Rackham's pirate sloop was surprised by a British pirate hunter in 1720, most of the crew reportedly hid below deck drunk. According to testimony, Anne Bonny and Mary Read stayed on deck fighting alone, firing pistols, swinging cutlasses while shouting at the men hiding below. One witness claimed Anne yelled, "If there's a man among ye, come up and fight like one." Well, in the end, Anne's fate remains a mystery. Rackham was hanged shortly after their capture. Anne Bonny and Mary Read avoided execution by claiming that they were pregnant, a legal delay known as pleading the belly. Mary Read died in prison, but Anne Bonny simply vanishes from the historical record. Some historians believe her wealthy father may have paid to secure her release, allowing her to return quietly to South Carolina, where she supposedly lived a long life under a different name. If true, one of history's most notorious pirates may have ended her days not on the gallows, but peacefully on land. Anne Bonny's story reminds us that the pirate world isn't just filled with hardened sailors and ruthless captains. Sometimes the fiercest fighters on deck was the one that society least expected. And for a time, she lived in the very place that inspired this podcast, the Pirate Republic itself. Chapter 11, Locked and Loaded. Edward Thatch stood across the street from the storefront with a sign in the window that said, Roy and Sons, Guns, Ammo, and Fishing Gear. As he gazed at the wooden one-story building, he let a smile cross his lips. He could hardly contain his excitement at what marvels he might find behind that door. Thatch didn't see himself as an overly violent man, surely no more than the average pirate. He wasn't one to be cruel without justification. Thatch relied more on fear and intimidation to achieve his goals. He found that with enough fear, he could plunder without harming, sinking, or destroying the treasure he sought. Many pirates made the mistake of taking things too far. It's much harder to pull gold from a ship that you sunk than one that has surrendered to you. Most sailors didn't want to die protecting some merchant's goods whom they hadn't, and most likely would never meet. If you started with violence, you left them with little choice but to retaliate with violence. He had learned the lesson that showing more guns, bigger guns, usually won the day, even without having fired a shot. Not good place to steal from, Tom said. Thatch looked down at his cabin boy, now dressed in dark blue pants, a white shirt, and a brown waistcoat. Sound advice, boy. We won't be stealing from them. You have money, you had no pockets. I have these, Thatch said, showing Tom his rings as he moved his fingers like he was playing a harpsichord. Several rings were adorned with gems, and others were thick gold bands with artistic details. I'll pocket a few so they don't get too greedy. He stuffed a few rings in the pocket of his pants and crossed the street after a horse-drawn wagon noisily drove by. They stood in front of the shop's door, and Thatch waited. Door, boy. Tom jumped in front and opened the door for Thatch to enter. As Thatch stepped inside, a whistle escaped his lips. There was a counter at the rear of the store, and shelves lined the side walls. Behind the counter, the wall bristled with rifles of varying lengths that covered the entire width of the store. The shelves along the sides were inventoried with fishing gear, holsters, belts, ammo, knives, and hats. Two men were behind the counter, both about 30 years old, bearded and bald-headed. These two are definitely related, thought Thatch, probably the sons of Roy, as the sign outside telegraphed. One of the men was sitting in a chair, busily working at a desk behind the counter. The other watched Thatch and Tom enter with interest. Welcome, friends. What can we help you with? Thatch approached the counter, eyes roaming around, admiring the array of weapons displayed. I'm looking for pistols, the ones that hold many rounds, Thatch said. Well, we have plenty of revolvers to choose from. You fancy a Colt or a Remington? I've got your standard 6-shooters, but I did get this foreign model that is a 7-shot. It's got some heft to it. The man began pulling several pistols from behind the counter and laying them out in a row. Thatch picked up the first one and held it in his hand, marveling at the workmanship and moving parts. He fumbled a bit with the chamber, turning it to see how it moved. Here, let me show you how this works. You look a bit green with guns, the man said to Thatch, taking the pistol from his hand. Under other circumstances, Thatch would have throttled him, but he was interested in how it operated, so he tolerated the man's insolence. Thatch watched as the man expertly ran through the spinning chamber, the trigger, the sights, and loading procedure. He then handed the unloaded pistol back, and Thatch worked through all the mechanisms that the man had shown him. That there is the Colt 45, excellent firearm with quick action and heavy stopping power. Thatch spent time looking over each pistol that lay on the counter. He turned and eyed the shelves that displayed holsters and belts. Some of the belts had small loops that would hold spare bullets. He glanced at Tom, who was looking closely at the pistol that held 7 rounds. He was trying to make out the writing that was in another language on the bottom of the grip. Thatch recognized the writing as Russian, though it was a language he hadn't studied. Well, what do you say? Any of these seem the right one for you, mister? Thatch turned to the man and pointed at each pistol. I'll take 2 of the Colts, 1 Remington, the Russian, some of the belts and holsters. Thatch looked at the wall with fishing gear that also held many knives, and several of them blades. The man stared for a moment, dumbstruck, and then looked over at his brother. His brother had finally got his nose out of the paperwork on his desk at Thatch's verbal list, and raised his thick eyebrows in return. Well then, I trust you have funds for these purchases? The brother sitting asked. Thatch removed several of his rings and set them on the counter. The second brother got up from his chair and came over to look at the rings. He took in his hand one that had a large ruby in the center. His eyes went up to his brother, then focused on Thatch. "That ruby real? Ain't glass, is it?" "That is a question I will not stoop to answer," growled Thatch, taking offense. The second brother found a jeweler's loupe and examined the ruby as well as the other rings on the counter. The first brother waited along with Thatch and Tom for the other brother to approve the trade while he weighed, then bit with his teeth on the gold rings. He finally looked at his brother and nodded his head. "Fair trade, friend. Let's get you locked and loaded up," the first brother said. Thatch looked down at Tom, who was still examining the Russian pistol. "You got something for the boy?" Thatch asked. Tom's face lit up with a smile. A few minutes later, Thatch and Tom exited the shop and walked side by side down the wooden sidewalk. Passers-by openly gaped and steered clear of them. Thatch caught a glance of his reflection in a store window he passed, and it pleased him greatly. He wore a holstered belt lined with bullets around his waist, which held the two matching Colt .45s against each hip. His chest held two more holstered belts on the outside of his waistcoat, each holding the two other pistols. On his right lower leg, he had a hunting knife strapped in a leather sheath, one on his waist belt in front and one more attached to the chest-mounted pistol belt. He looked down at his cabin boy, who held his gleaming new pistol in both hands, turning it with admiration. It was small and compact, with a polished pearl grip. "What did the man say yours was called?" "Derringer. It's a beauty, first one?" Tom nodded his head. He repeatedly holstered it and pulled it out from a chest-strapped holster under his jacket. Two older women who were sitting in chairs out front of a clothing store saw this and scoffed, making faces while they watched him draw the small gun and wave it around. Thatch noticed this and shot them a devilish grin. "He's a wild one, ladies. Best watch out before he shoots those ratty wigs right off your heads." Thatch let out a hearty laugh as he passed by. Once they passed around the corner, he put his hand on the boy's pistol. "Let's keep it safe and stowed for now. If it's your first, I'll teach you how to use it. Aim it, clean it. Treat your weapons right, and they'll be in good working order for when you need them." "That's another pirate code. You remembering them codes as I tell you?" "Yes, Captain." "That's a good lad." Thatch stopped at a street corner. He looked down each way. "Time to find me mates. You ever heard of a drinking place called the Paris?" Tom nodded. "Everyone has." "Well then, lead the way." Colette Dallaire shuffled the single deck of cards with nimble fingers, flipping them gracefully between each other like they were performing a choreographed dance. The young ranch hand directly across from her was watching with an awed expression on his face. She glanced at his eyes, then realized he wasn't paying so much attention to her card skills as the cleavage visible above her fitted dress. She smiled back at him, not because she liked the attention, but she now knew he was an easy mark. This was the kind of man who would sit at the table until all his money was gone and cause no trouble, despite the outcome. It was the fellers that had eyes only for the cards she worried most about. 21 was a game that wasn't overly difficult to increase your odds if you were good at counting cards. This was something Colette had excelled at for as long as she could remember. A good head for numbers was what her dad had called it, something her mother wasn't so proud of. A girl's head should get fuzzy when it comes to numbers. "Just remember your posture and poise, Colette," her mom had always said to her. That's the way to find a good man. She looked over at the other two men seated at her table. One was a supply store owner who was on his way to being drunk as a skunk by nightfall. The man seated at the far right was the one she would have to watch. His eyes never left the cards. He wasn't counting, that she knew. His name was Gabriel, one of the sergeants in the police force. He made his rounds each week, gambling at different halls, mostly losing his money. Colette did her best to guide him in choosing the correct play so that the damage was minimal or that he would walk away with a little more than he came in with. Best to keep the law on her side, or at least not against her. Gabriel stared so hard at Colette's hand that she was sure he was trying his best to see through to the other side of the cards. "You boys ready for another round of drinks?" Colette asked. The men just nodded or grunted assent. Colette smiled and motioned to one of the waitress girls, who then busied herself at the bar preparing drinks. The Paris was already lively this afternoon with drinkers and gamblers. Colette sometimes marveled at her own ability to grow her saloon's business as fast as she had. In just under 2 years, the Paris had become the premier saloon and gambling hall on the Barbary Coast. San Francisco was the fastest growing city in the United States, and at this rate she would need to expand into a second location or add to the building she currently owned. Colette saw opportunity everywhere she looked. She just needed to keep investing her profits. She had been quietly buying plots of land and several buildings along the waterfront for the past several months. Soon, she would not have to sit in front of these men dealing cards, smelling their foul breath, and having to put up with their leering eyes. Colette would promote one of the ladies working for her to manager and let them run the Paris. She was growing tired of dealing with the troublesome cowboys, gangsters, thieves, and politicians that blew through her door. She looked up at that moment as the door swung open and the picture of the devil himself entered. It was that wild man from the other night with the giant black beard twisted in braids. He stood momentarily in the doorway, surveying his surroundings with his sharp blue eyes that existed in contrast below the heavy black brows. Gone was the ornate, old-fashioned clothing that he had worn soaking wet from his last appearance. Now he was elegantly dressed in pants, white shirt, and fitted waistcoat. His antique weapons were replaced with an excessive number of new pistols and knives strapped to his body. Colette imperceptibly shook her head. The man had a flair for the grandiose. His name, Thatch, popped into her head as he turned his gaze on her. His eyes bored into hers, and that cat that ate the canary grin of his formed on his face. Colette immediately chastised herself as she felt an uncontrolled blush rise in her cheeks. She felt sure that he had noticed because he strutted, self-assured, over to her table and elegantly bowed, then, in a roguish fashion, sat in the vacant seat of her table. Once he was seated, she noticed a small Chinese boy, similarly dressed, standing behind him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thatch. Welcome back to the Paris. We were sorry to see you leave in such haste last night," Colette said. "It was rude of me to depart without saying so much as a goodbye. I hope that you could forgive my manners, Miss Dallaire." Colette began the dealing of the cards to the other three men as she spoke with Thatch. "I suppose you have returned to claim the belongings that you had left behind." "That, and if you might know the whereabouts of me friends." Colette smiled and flipped one of her cards over for the players to see. It was a 6, which put a smile on all the players' lips. "I have put aside your clothing, but you should know that the strange military men that interrupted your evening confiscated your weapons," Colette said. "That is of no matter. I was able to acquire new armament," Thatch said with a wave of his hand. "I can see that." Colette motioned to the players if they would like additional cards, and all declined. She flipped over her second card that showed a 10, giving her the total of 16. She dealt herself an additional card that showed a 7. A muted round of cheers emerged from the players as Colette busted and gave them winning hands. She paid out the men and gathered the cards. "The men and women that had accompanied you had mostly gone their separate ways after that poor young feller you were with was killed in the gunfight. The only two who remained once you went upstairs were the older bald man and the angry-looking feller that also took a pretty waitress to a room. He then escaped out the back during your scuffle. The bald man seemed to be on better terms with the military men than you had been. They left together shortly after, and I haven't seen them since, nor any of your friends." Thatch leaned back in his chair. "Jennings, it's as I thought. I never did trust the man. It makes more sense now that he'd be in league with the Royal Navy." "Royal Navy?" asked Gabriel. He looked Thatch up and down. "You some sort of outlaw?" Thatch looked over at the man, noticing the badge clipped to his vest. "A misunderstanding. I'm just a humble trader from England. I assure you I have broken none of your laws in this fine town," Thatch said with a smile. "See to it that you don't," Gabriel said after setting his money down for his next bet. "I'm thirsty, Captain," Tom said from behind Thatch. "Aye, Tom. Acquire us a bottle of rum." Thatch motioned the boy to the bar, and Tom quickly made his way over. Colette shook her head gently. "We don't allow children in the Paris, Mr. Thatch." Thatch turned and looked at Tom standing at the bar, trying to get the attention of the large native barkeep, and gave a hearty laugh. "Child? Old Tom there is part of me crew. He may be small, but he's 20 years old, I assure you." He smiled at Colette and the men at the table, and then leaned in conspiratorially. "We all know these Chinese are of a small stature. I heard it's because of their strange diet. Don't let him hear you talk about his size, though. He has a fuse to match his height and the nastiness of an angered cobra. He joined me crew 2 years ago after we captured a sloop en route to New Providence from the Orient. Turned out old Tom was quite the tailor and skilled at repairing worn and damaged sails. Colette ignored the obvious lie and continued to deal her game. She nodded consent to her large native bartender to give the boy the bottle of rum. "Are you going to play a hand or just continue to flap your gums?" Gabriel asked. I do remember enjoying the winnings from my last round playing Miss Delaire's clever little game," Thatch said. "Do you have any money to wager, Mr. Thatch?" asked Colette. "Were there any coins left in my discarded clothing I left in your room last night?" Colette once again blushed against Thatch's stare. She watched his lips turn the slightest bit up beneath his braided black beard as he played with the insinuation that she had shared that room with him. "Let me ask the waitress who entertained you." She turned to look around the room. "No matter, I happen to have several paper notes I exchanged earlier." Thatch removed bills from his pocket and set them on the table. Tom arrived with the bottle of rum, an empty glass, and a glass filled with water. Thatch poured a healthy portion of the caramel-colored rum into the tumbler and drank the contents. "Ah, that is fine." He looked over at Tom, who had finished off his water and held out his hand for Tom's glass. Thatch poured a few fingers of rum into the glass and handed it back to the boy. He then poured himself another helping. He looked at Colette as she gave a slight scowl toward him, and he only raised an eyebrow in response. "Are we playing cards?" Gabriel moaned. "We are," Colette said, and began to deal the hand, while watchfully eyeing the young boy sip tentatively on his glass of rum. Several card hands and half a bottle of rum later, the saloon door opened, and the booming voice of Black Caesar rang through the hall. "Captain Blackbeard," he said, and his long strides quickly brought him to the gambling table where Thatch sat. Thatch rose and clasped the big man's arm in greeting. "In the flesh," Thatch said, as Hornigold, Charlotte, Mary, and Vane each greeted him as well. "Let's find a table to talk in private." Thatch pushed a small stack of bills toward Colette. "Food and drink for me, mates. Miss Delaire, if you please." He then led the pirates to an empty back table with Tom trailing behind. They all sat and then stared in question while Tom took a seat at the end. "This here's Mr. Tom, me new cabin boy. He's proven to be of great value in this unfamiliar port. He hasn't taken the pirate oath, but been living the life for a long time, so treat him as one of our crew." Vane rolled his eyes and sighed audibly. "We ain't a crew. We are all pirates, maybe the only ones left, so we need to stay together, crew or not," Hornigold said. Tom sat silently, watching the adults with his brow furrowed. Charlotte looked at the boy while cleaning her fingernails with a cutthroat dagger. She squinted one tan eye at him. Tom squinted an eye at her in mimic. "Does your cabin boy talk?" Charlotte asked. "When appropriate. Now fill me in on what has happened since you laid poor Calico Jack to rest," Thatch said. I hope you're enjoying this historical fiction book with pirates and time travel all wound together in it. You can find the ebook and physical books at my website, briancantrell.com. You can also find the second book in this series, Pirates of World War II. And if you're a fan of pirates, you can check out thepiraterepublic.com. It's a weekly newsletter that I put out every Friday. All sorts of great pirate history, events, news, and happenings. You can also toss a few doubloons our way by joining our Patreon at Patreon, The Pirate Republic. We'll see you next week. Till then, fair winds and keep a weathered eye.